Schön, dass ihr alle gekommen seid heute. Wir haben zwei ganz besondere Gäste und wir haben ein besonderes Buch. And so that the guests understand what we're talking about in English. This book, I have to say, touched me deeply when I read it now. Because although we see for a year already now, every day, the images of war and destruction on all of our screens, it is always a different thing when you read the accounts of the people who are under these conditions in words, in print. I think there is something especially deep in books. That's probably where the tradition of books never ceased to exist, even if there were other media developed. Our guests tonight, who are the authors or publishers of these stories, are Mahmoud Muna, who is on my right. He's a writer and publisher, and above all for me, he is the famous bookseller of Jerusalem, because his bookshop, the educational bookshop, and the bookshop at the American Colony Hotel is a legend, because you would, all of us, I think, would always come in the middle of the stress of the Middle East conflict, between all the conversations, you would step into that bookshop, surrounded by all these wise publications from Palestinian authors, from the whole Middle East, and have this moment of, you know, a calm moment where you thought there must be a conversation possible because this bookshop exists. So that's Mahmoud, who is writing also regularly in the London Review of Books, the Jerusalem Quarterly, and he's now on tour for a few weeks already on an almost daily talk about the book here with his co-author Matthew Teller, who is on my left, who is a UK-based author who lives outside of London. He's also a broadcaster. He writes on place and culture. And he has a special focus on Palestine. His book, 9 Quarters of Jerusalem, a new biography of the old city, was a Daily Telegraph book of the year, which I thought was a bit strange, the Daily Telegraph. Okay, fine.
I'll take it where I can get it.
Yeah, exactly. He also produces and presents documentaries for the BBC Radio 4, our favorite radio, that's sort of like Ö1, and the World Service, which probably all of you see, usually, if you want to know something about world politics. And also you report for BBC radios from our own correspondent. But this book that they now worked on for the last year?
Less,
a little bit less.
Since about January. We can talk about this as well,
yeah.
But it was about January, February when things started to
really pick up.
When we got the green light to begin. So.
And these stories which you will hear about now, because we'll ask Matthew to have a little presentation also of the situation and what Gaza actually is. And Mahmoud will also talk about how the book came together. There are so many touching stories in it. Some of them are also so touching because the authors, meanwhile, have been killed. It's just really breathtaking how we all sit and talk about things here and how difficult life is in Gaza. So Matthew, please, if I can ask you to do your presentation.
Absolutely can ask me. Thank you very much indeed. So yes, the format will be as Tessa said, I'll speak for about 20-25 minutes or so with images, and then I'll hand over to Mahmoud, who will also speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open up to a discussion. Let me find, first of all, a drink of water, and second of all, that. And of course, I want to say as well, thank you very much indeed to the Kreisky Foundation, the Kreisky Forum, for the invitation to speak today and for bringing us over and for facilitating this, this evening's discussion too. Gaza is not my city. And Palestine is not my country, and they never will be. Many Palestinians, and I'm sure maybe even some people in this room, cannot visit Palestine because of the passport that I hold, British, because of my skin color, because of the fact that I was born into a Jewish family. I'm extremely lucky to have been able to visit Palestine dozens of times, hundreds of times since I was a child. The only foreign holidays we ever took when I was growing up were to Israel. When I was 13, my father, amazingly, arranged for me to have my bar mitzvah twice. Once in the synagogue that we used at home in London, where it was our regular synagogue, and again in Jerusalem as well. Israel was positive. Israel was good. And that filled the first 20 years or so of my life. The next 20, thanks again to my passport and to my skin color and to the bundle of privileges that come associated with that, I was able to move around. I lived in Cairo, I lived in Amman, I lived in occupied Jerusalem. I visited Sabra and Shatila in Beirut. I traveled through Syria and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf and all over Palestine and a bunch of other places as well, listening to new stories or listening to new ways of telling the stories that I thought I already understood, slowly grasping the scale of the injustice that had been committed, ostensibly in my name and for my benefit. Now, there have been 100 years, maybe more, 150, maybe 200 years of people like me, white, well-educated, English-speaking, middle-aged, middle-class, men, in particular men, claiming the Holy Land for themselves, for their nation, for their empire, for their religion, and then very often publishing books and speaking in front of audiences, much like this one, to stake their claim. That's not why I've done what I've done, as I hope you'll see if you get a chance to read the books. I write because I can see an imbalance in narratives. Imagining that this is a conflict with two sides, and then trying to treat those two sides equally will never be equitable, because Israel has the overwhelmingly larger proportion of assets, resources, power, status, money, influence, visibility. This is not a debating society, for, against. This is a genocide. We have a moral imperative to act unequally in the name of balance. Now, Gaza. Gaza wasn't always a strip. So this tiny little sliver of land with its fortified fences around it is an invention of 20th century power politics. This was just the last bit of land that the Egyptian army was able to defend against Israeli aggression when the armistice lines were drawn in 1949. It has no historical validity whatsoever. Before Israel, under the British occupation, Gaza was then known as a sub-district. It was a much larger area. It took in neighboring towns and villages and lots of fertile agricultural land as well. Before the British, under the Ottomans, Gaza was administered from Jerusalem, and it took in this wide hinterland of terrain up and down the coast, and also extending down into the desert. And that's just to say that the administrative space known as Gaza has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk again down to this blockaded concentration camp that we see today. And all of that, of course, doesn't reflect what you might call the psychogeography of the place. This is a work by the Gazan artist Hibba Zarqut, and she paints herself in an imagined state of idealized freedom before the Nakba, standing among the fields and the buildings of Istud. And Istud was a village in that hinterland of Gaza that I talked about. It was depopulated at gunpoint in 1948, ethnically cleansed, as we say now, and is now absorbed into the Israeli city of Ashdod. But it was once Gaza. And Gaza has 5,000 years of recorded history. We know that Gaza was settled during Egypt's first dynasty of pharaohs, which is something like 3000 BCE. Goliath was from not Istud, but another of Gaza's villages in that hinterland, a village which is also now absorbed into Israel, into the state of Israel. Talking about Goliath, let me just do this very quickly. This is a story within a story. About 3,200 years ago, the Sea People arrived. Now, we only know about the Sea People from fragmentary inscriptions, but it seems that there was some kind of mass movement across the Mediterranean, from west to east. They seem to have invaded the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. Was it an invasion? Was it not? We're not really sure. Who were the Sea People? We're also not really sure. We don't know. It seems that they were some kind of a sort of a loose cultural confederation. Some came from Sicily, some came from Sardinia, some came from Turkey or the islands of the Aegean. Different groups settled in different places. One of them was the Peleset, or the Pulashti, or the Palastu. Their name is recorded in slightly different variations. But they always have these four core consonants. And they settled on the coast around what's now Gaza. And over time, they grew more powerful, so that when outsiders wanted to refer to that land where they were, this stretch of land around Gaza, they called it Philistia, using the same consonants after the name of the people who had arrived from the sea. Now, Goliath, as I said previously, Goliath was a Philistine from Philistia. And even after the Philistines were conquered, this name stuck. And I should add at this point, in many Semitic languages, Hebrew and Arabic and other ones, p and f are the same letter. They're differentiated sometimes by a diacritical dot, but what the one sound developed from the other sound, they're essentially the same, which is why Peleset and Philistia come from the same root. 500 years later, the Greek historian Herodotus is writing about this same area. What does he call it? He naturally refers to the age-old name that was already in existence, and because he was Greek, he gave it a Greek rendering. That's the name that he used. So then, from that point until today, there's a direct link with the four consonants, p, l, s, t, which link right back to the Sea People, whoever they were, and wherever they came from. So when people tell you, there's no P in Arabic, so how can Palestine exist? Or the Romans created Palestine, or, you have this thing, Yasser Arafat invented Palestine in 1964 or something. All of it is nonsense. Just remember Goliath. And also remember if somebody calls you a Philistine, that's a compliment, right? Anyway, let's move on through a few more centuries of history. After Herodotus, Alexander the Great was in Gaza. Gaza got rich trading frankincense from Arabia to Rome. In the 6th century, Gaza was a center of Christian scholarship. Gaza is known in Islam as Ghazat Hashem. Hashem's Gaza. Hashem is the great-grandfather of the Prophet Muhammad. And there are traditions of Islamic pilgrimage to his tomb in what's now Gaza City that go back almost 1,000 years or more. By the 17th century, Gaza is a big, important place. Trade is flourishing. Its Christian and Jewish minorities are protected. A diplomat, French diplomat, stationed in Jerusalem, at this time, referred to Gaza as the capital of Palestine. Napoleon invaded in 1799. He said Gaza's forests of olives and citrus trees reminded him of Languedoc, which is beautiful. Until you remember that 2 days later, Napoleon took his army northwards and then murdered several thousand people in Jaffa and then carried on murdering up the coast as well. That's a different story. Just a word about this painting. One of our book's contributors is a man called Chris Whitman Abdul Karim, and he lives in Kufr Aqab, which is a district of Jerusalem, between Jerusalem and Ramallah, very close. And he often goes to and from Gaza for his work. He bought the original of this painting from the artist, Hibba, in person, when he was in Gaza on October the 3rd last year, 4 days before all of this horror erupted. And it's painted on canvas. He rolled up the canvas and he carried it by hand with him through all the checkpoints back to Jerusalem, to his home, where it is now. 10 days later, Hibba was killed by an Israeli airstrike, along with 2 of her children. She was 39 years old. Please, Google her name. Her art is viewable all over the internet. It's on Instagram. There's a website. It's very accessible. Her name and her art deserve to be remembered. But of course, Gaza has been destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt countless times. I want to play you, if the tech will stay with us, an extraordinarily evocative audio clip which was recorded last May by Dr. Mohammed Aral-Kurdi, who is a specialist in limb reconstruction. He works for Medical Aid for Palestinians inside Gaza. And he speaks extraordinarily powerfully. And I should say, if you think his voice is evocative, which it is, you should read his writing. We were very privileged to be able to include his writing as well. I'm going to hold this up to the mic and hope that everyone can hear.
I was driving from Khan Yunis to Deir al-Balah, taking the coastal road, from where one is able to catch sight of Gaza, my home. Smoke was coming from the western part of it, and that's where I lived. Literally, my neighborhood was burning, or in other words, my home was burning. What killed me most was when I turned on the radio, Fairuz was streaming and singing, "Take me home, Ruddani ila biladi." When it first started, they said only 3 days and you'll get back home. And now we're counting more than 7 months, living the worst conditions a human being can endure. Displaced, the majority of us thirsty, with no access to drinking clean water, sometimes hungry, surrounded by death and destruction.
For this book, we talked to more than 100 people. And we want to thank all of those who are still alive to be able to hear it. There's some remarkable writing. Through a friend of a friend of a friend, I was put in touch with Hussam al-Madhoun. And he is a social worker in Gaza. He's a child protection officer. He's not a poet, he's not a writer, he's unpublished, unrecognized. He was keeping a daily diary for himself and for his friends. Reading the way that he describes the scenes around him and the people with compassion and with a sense of dignity and power, takes your breath away. It's extraordinary. I couldn't quite believe what I was reading when I first read it. It's incredible. And there were so many other names as well. Saba Timraz is one. She's a young woman, 20 years old. She was stuck inside Gaza for 184 days with her sister. Her parents happened to be outside on October the 7th last year. And she and her sister survived that long, and then they were able to get out. She's now in Cairo. And the way that she writes about resistance and defiance is the word. Extraordinarily visceral writing with fury. And she's able to express it even in the midst of all of the horror that she's been facing and dealing with. And there are many, many other names as well. Ashraf Afifi is one. Mahmoud Muna is another. We were very lucky to be able to include the story of Salim Arayes. He's a local historian. He's a keeper of Gaza's documentary heritage. We were very lucky to have an interview with a man called Yusuf al-Khoury. He is a theologian, and he's able to trace, he was born and brought up in Gaza, he's able to trace his family's connections with Gaza's Orthodox Church back centuries upon centuries, almost 1,000 years again, and so on and so on and so forth. I'd like to play you just one more clip if I can. This is taken from voice notes which were sent to us by Amani Shaltut. And Amani, she's an extraordinary woman. She is the director of the United Nations, the UNRWA photo archive in Gaza City. We were put in touch with her. She very kindly offered to respond. I sent her some questions by text. She chose to reply by voice. One of the questions I asked her was about her favorite images in the archive that she looks after. She replies to that question in this clip. But also she was displaced when she recorded these messages back to us. She was in the camp in Nusayrat, which is to the south of Gaza City. As with the previous clip, where you could hear the drones passing overhead, those drones, Israeli drones, are sometimes surveillance drones, they're sometimes attack drones where they'll shoot as well. You can hear them in the background when Amani speaks too. But what you can also hear as she is responding to my trivial, stupid questions, wanting to her voice to be heard, wanting to engage, wanting to contribute, you can also hear the bombs falling around her as well. I find this incredibly moving.
Hi, and Salam from Gaza. First of all, I wish you all the best in your book. About my favorite images are those about education, particularly those show children learning in open air or in the tents, where some of the pupils were sitting on the sands and they don't even have seats. Actually, for me, these images show the desire and a need to change for better and a kind of a challenge to all of these tough circumstances, and that mustn't be the fate forever. And as we used to say that education is the passport for our better future, and also it could be make us proud of our identity. Many thanks for you and for all those who stand in solidarity with Gaza. It's really appreciated, and actually what you are doing is a turning point in history.
By a series of chances, I was able to unearth a story about Gaza that, as far as I know, has never been told. Certainly not outside of Arabic anyway, about the pioneers of photography. Hrant Nakashian, who took this extraordinarily powerful picture in the 1950s, was one of those pioneers. He was a photographer for the United Nations for UNRWA, and during our research for this book, a friend introduced me to his son, who now lives in Jerusalem with his family. And he shared many stories of his childhood. He remembers distinctly growing up in Gaza in the 1960s. And he shared some images from his father's archive, an extraordinarily rich vein of social history. Here, on the left-hand side, this very fine-looking gentleman, his name is Levon Yotnach-Parian. He has an extraordinary life story. He is a hero of the Armenian genocide. I was able to go into his life a little bit in the book, but I'm hoping that the little tendrils and the pieces of the story that I was able to put together will encourage scholars and historians who are better placed than me to take this material forward and to start filling gaps in our knowledge of Gaza and its social history. He had a whole series of adventures. He personally saved several thousand people's lives during the First World War. He moved to Gaza in 1927. This is him with his wife and their 5 children pictured in the courtyard of their family home in Gaza City. Slightly later than that, about 1939, maybe 1940. And I was able extraordinarily to track down 2 of his grandsons who now live in Los Angeles. And they also shared stories and tales and pictures to be able to piece some of that story together. This man over here highlighted on the right, he is Kerem Cegalian. He is the third of these 3 pioneering Gazan photographers. He set up Gaza's first professional photography studio business in 1944. And I was able to talk to his daughter, pictured beside him. She now lives in France. And she also remembers clearly growing up in Gaza as a young girl and as a teenager. And also Kerem's grandson, who shared stories and images from his family archive. And as well as the story of photography, this little history, which I was able to put together, also sheds light on another of Gaza's untold stories, which is the story of its Armenian minority. All 3 of these families are Armenian. The Armenians are closely bound into the history of photography, not just in Palestine, but across the Middle East. And there were other stories too. Another story covered the time when Che Guevara, the famous Cuban revolutionary, and Malcolm X, the famous American human rights campaigner, activist, both visited Gaza a few years apart, 1959 and 1964. And that was in the era when Gaza was under Egypt, under Nasser. And Nasser was aligning his country, Egypt, with anti-colonial national liberation movements in Africa and in Asia and in Cuba and Latin America as well. This is an image of a poster advertising an event that never happened. Gaza was down to be the host city for the 4th African Men's Basketball Championships of 1967. If you see the date, that the championship was scheduled for. It's July 1967. A few weeks before this, Israel invaded Gaza and occupied, and the championships never happened. But seeing evidence of Gaza's identity as an African city, as a center of African culture and African sport, added for me another layer of depth, of understanding of what Gaza is and who Gaza's people are, and that element of social history which is so often overlooked. And of course, Gaza didn't stop being African. We were honored and also very lucky to be able to include stories from Gaza's current African Palestinian minority, tiny minority, 2% or so, including the amazing Haifa. She is a professional singer and a voiceover artist. She talked very openly to Mahmoud about the sexism and the racism that she's experienced in her life in Gaza, but she also said, quote, "I love the fact that as people of color, we are part of mixed, cosmopolitan, diverse Palestinian society," unquote. This is a time of evaluation. It seems important to say that history, as Gaza was, as Gaza is now, was recorded, and that reality was not forgotten, and that the oppressed and the survivors had chances to be heard. We're not authors of this book, creating something new. We're editors, trying to listen, trying to elicit, trying to encourage, trying to amplify. That difference, I think, is critical. This book does not give voice to the voiceless. The people of Gaza and the people everywhere have voices. They've been shouting and yelling and screaming, and very, very few people have been listening. They're writing, and they'll continue to write their own stories, their way, in their words, by themselves, in this unspeakably bad situation. We're not invited to have an opinion. We are simply invited to bear witness, to say, I see you, I hear you, and then to use that as a spur to act, to actively intervene to the best of our ability, and then to be able to encourage others to be able to say the same thing. 2 weeks into Israel's assault on Gaza last year, Pier Battista Pizzaballa, who is the head of the Roman Catholic Church in Jerusalem, said this, quote, "It takes courage to be able to demand justice without spreading hatred. It takes courage to ask for mercy, to reject oppression, to promote equality without demanding uniformity," unquote. Thank you very much indeed for listening. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Mahmoud, who's going to talk a little bit about how this book came about and some of the background to it. Thank you.
I can do it from here.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for Christ-Key Forum for inviting us and for taking care of us. And thank you very much, Tess, for chairing this afternoon. You started with the bookshop, and I want to take you back to the bookshop, to my time in Jerusalem in November, December. I think many of us were in the same situation. We had this list of friends or contacts that we know in Gaza, and we were spending the best part of our mornings calling them, checking on them, text messages, phone calls, and so on. And we had this horrible list, and you put text next to it. And you do that every day. And sometimes it involves a phone call or a WhatsApp call. And I was doing this like everyone. And as the days started to progress into December, the phone calls started to come shorter and get shorter and shorter and shorter. And even the messages started to become shorter and shorter and shorter. To the point that you almost wanted the phone call to end in exactly the same second someone's pick up the line. Because there's nothing you don't know anymore. There is nothing you can help with. You can't even ask them what I can do for you because you can't do anything. And you can't really ask them how are you or how things are because one, you know. Second, it's really difficult and you know that. This moment of inhumanity that you feel as a very sociable person, to juxtapose that with the Palestinian social life, with always wanted to speak further and always having conversation and so on, the inhumanity of shrinking our social habits to become almost measured in seconds was a very, very provoking experience for me. And into the new year, I decided we must find ways to gain back our humanity by making our conversations with our beloved ones longer again. Just this very small contribution to actually have a longer conversation. Because that's at least we can do that. At least we can have a longer conversation. So my New Year resolution was to expand on that conversation and to get people to speak. And I'll come to that later, how that developed even further. The second, perhaps, motivation or personal experiences that I had is as the news was being reported from Gaza, there was this emphasis on people being killed and buildings being destroyed. And there was nothing about how the social fabric, how the city is being undone, how there is almost a void of news of how the functionality and the normality of that city has suddenly stopped. This quickly reminded me of my own pursuit of research on how the Palestinian life was before 1948. And when I speak with my dad and his generation, you know, they give you fragments of how it was. But mostly the experience of Nakba is categorized with, of course, destroyed villages, depopulated, displaced, refugee crisis, and building being destroyed. But what were people doing before 48, you have very little information about. And you have to really do your research into how life was before 48 to understand how the society was functioning. And then you get surprised, like, wow, there was, you know, Australia national team came to play with Palestinian national team in Palestine. So, there was sport. And it was like, oh, wow, architect. You know, the architect of the Empire State in the US was the same architect who built the YMCA tower in King George Street. It's like, wow, so there was architectural life as well. Wow, there was music school. There was education, there was trade, there was commerce, there was car importing and exporting. And then suddenly you know, you learn, you admit that there was a much more to 48 than just displacement of people and destruction of life. There was a destruction of society. There was a fabric of culture and of society and trade and economy and so on that was completely undone in 48. And that's actually the tragic of the Nakba. And the tragic of Gaza, as much as it is about loss of life and destruction of building, but it's also about society was undone. And it kind of provoked me that we must document that as well. In addition to documenting the loss of life and the building, it's also the society itself. How Gaza was as a city before the genocide started. And not just from the perspective of urban planning or from the perspective of the city, but actually from the perspective of the people themselves. And the best way to do this is actually to engage on how the people tell the story of their own city and of their own life before October. These two parallel lines really have informed all the discussion, the early discussion, from as early as November even with Matthew, that we must do something about Gaza, and then fed into the project. As this conversation started to become longer, I was surprised, we were surprised of how much people actually wanted to talk. That we were oppressing them by having, how are you? Are you alive today? That people actually wanted to talk. And in no time, people started to spend 20 and 25 and 30 minutes with us, telling us and answering all types of our stupid questions, if you like, or minimal questions or life questions. A lot of the times they were taking time from their families. We had people who would say, call me at 12 o'clock, I'm gonna move somewhere where there's internet and then we can talk. And suddenly you're thinking, wow, someone is living under genocide, under bombing, literally, is actually gonna travel at night, which is the most off-risk of times, somewhere, just so he can have internet or she can have internet to talk to you. And you feel I don't know what to call it. It's a privilege coupled with responsibility in the same time, that you are being almost entrusted with people's life stories. And I think the project suddenly started to feel like it is a weight on our shoulder, actually. Us both and our co-workers as well, how this has become a really a documentation of a people's life, of a city's life during a very important time. The book, if you get your hands on it, it will make you cry, as you'd expect, but it will also make you laugh in a lot of places. And you know, if you know the Palestinian story, you know you are on the right way if Palestinians make you laugh and cry in the same time, because that's trademark almost with the Palestinian experience. It's full of pain, but it's also full of hope. Maybe I'll read a small part and then come back if I can find my page. My name is Nuruddin Hajjaj. I'm a Palestinian writer. I'm 27 years old, and I have many dreams. I'm not a number, and I do not consent to my death being passing news. Say too that I love life, happiness, freedom, children laughter, the sea, coffee, writing, Fayrouz, everything that is joyful, though these things will all disappear in a space of a moment. One of my dreams is for my books and my writings to travel the world, for my pen to have wings that no unstamped passport or visa rejection can hold back. Another dream of mine is to have a family, a small family, to have a little son who looks like me and to tell him a bedtime story as I rock him in my arms. My greatest dream is that my country will have peace, that children will smile more brightly than the sun, that we will plant flowers in every place a bomb once fell, that we will trace out our freedom on every wall that has been destroyed, that war will finally leave us alone so we can for once live our life. This is, I mean, I can relate to this a lot because of course it's about writing and books, but this is, I think it's a very telling example of how all the stories we were getting, there was almost a request that they have to be framed within a hopeful framing. That this is not about pity or about charity or about sadness. This is the stories were giving in a note of hope, and they wanted to convey hope. And certainly all the people we talked to, they gave us, you know, what you'd expect of a package of people living in war, but they were also always ending or planting there the note of hope. And I think that's complexity, as I said, with privilege and responsibility, with pain and hope, laugh and cry, is one of these contradictory, if you like, elements that keep coming into the book. The sense of responsibility we felt had to influence many of the things we're doing. First of all, the book was supposed to be half the size, and in no time we figured out that we're getting a lot of really important contributions from a diversity of voices. A lot of the things were coming in Arabic, in English, so there's a question of translation and editing, and we still have to get your thoughts and other people's thoughts on how good we have done, but it's dealt with this with the absolute responsibility that we could, giving the frame of time. The frame of time is important because as you started with asking Matthew in the beginning, by January, February, we knew that we are doing something really interesting here. We couldn't, maybe we'll dig into that later, we couldn't get a final contract from a publisher until maybe February or even, April into even March into April. And then the deadline was that the book needed to come out in October. So we had to work fast. But another thing that was driving us fast is losing people. We're interviewing people, getting to come back to them again, not finding them, left, dead, sometimes, unfortunately. And suddenly we had to, weirdly, we had to pace our speeds as the speed of the Israeli armed forces killing people. I mean, it's by March, April, the whole push into the south and the whole loss of internet and communication started to really be visible for us. And we couldn't anymore reach the people that we wanted as easily as we wanted. Maybe I'll ask you, Matthew, to read
I'm happy to.
94?
94. This is one of the diary pieces by Hussam al-Madhoun, who I mentioned when I was speaking. This is dated 18th of February 2024. See yourself for a shekel. A boy in the market is holding a tiny piece of mirror, encouraging people to look at their faces for 1 shekel, which is about 20 euro cents. He is making a living by offering a very rare service. I have not seen my face since I arrived in Rafah many weeks ago. You can't buy mirrors anymore. Anyway, a mirror is something that you forget about in this situation. How you look doesn't matter. I ask him, do you make money this way? And he tells me he does. Lots of people want to see themselves, he says. I make 30 shekels a day or more. But you see him, and the boy points to a man down the street who's walking away from us. He looked at his face, but then he gave the mirror back to me without paying. I'm not stopping him, though. He had a cut from his face all the way down to his chest, a long, horrible cut, not healed well at all. I think it was from shrapnel. He looked at his big, ugly scar, and when he gave me back the mirror, I saw that he was crying, so I just let him go. I took the boy's mirror and looked at my face. It's got very skinny. I have no mirror for shaving, so the stubble on my chin is all uneven, some bits longer than other bits. I'm a mess. I did not cry. I gave the child 2 shekels and continued walking.
I will just finish by saying I was 2 years old in 1984, to give away my age quickly, when Edward Said was interviewed, and he said the Palestinians as if need permission to narrate. And the 60s, 70s, even before that, definitely into the 80s, there was this almost traditions that the Palestinians in writing, the writings on Palestine is not by Palestinians. And the Palestinians have no right to write their own narrative. And I think Said himself, but definitely generations of that after writer, and I speak now as a bookseller, has almost gained by force almost this right to narrate. And I would like to see this book and our attempt here, rather than writing about Gaza, but rather by picking up the people from Gaza to write their own narrative and their own story, is continue this tradition that the Palestinians have started 15, 20 years ago, in retrospect, to actually regain the right to narrate. Without gatekeeping, without expectation, without that they have to fit into a certain narrative or a certain line or a certain voice for a Western audience or for a European audience. We hope that we have clearly and objectively, in a way, without too much interference, beyond obvious language and editing, is to kind of bring this voice into the discussion today. To speak about hope and to speak about Gaza now 1 year on is really not an easy conversation. Of course, there's a whole political dimension that is out there, and it should be out there. And I hope these voices, in so many ways, are actually also contributing to the political discussion on Gaza. So when we speak about Gaza, we're not speaking only as a politicians, or we speak only as an analyst or as experts on the Middle East and so on. That's also the conversation about Gaza, and the past and the future of Gaza is also informed by the voices of the Gazans themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I mean, because you mentioned Edward Said's famous essay, Permission to Narrate. Unfortunately, of course, we are now in a situation where the Palestinian narrative is being heard, but on the back of a total tragedy. And one of the issues that you just mentioned it a little bit, but there is an archive of the books, of course also in Jerusalem, but also in Gaza, of the old Palestinian texts. And I wonder what happens now if there's an attempt to bring the archive out of Gaza, because it might, I remember I was in Grozny once after it was flattened by the Russian army in the capital of Chechnya. It almost didn't exist when I saw the ruins then. And they told me the story how they tried to bring out the last books that hadn't been burned. And I'm wondering if there's any thought about this now going on, how to save documents and text.
I'll answer a little bit. I'm happy to pass over to Mahmoud as well. If there are current conversations, I'm not aware of them. But the issue of archives, written archives, photographic archives that I talked about as well, is obviously live, and it's obviously of extreme importance. There's an element here as well which reflects back on the Nakba too, because the Palestinians lost so much of their own archive, personal and what would you call it? It's not a state, but on a macro level, macro social level, in 1948, and so the control of archives has been very much used as a weapon, as a tool of domination, as a tool of occupation. How that plays out in Gaza at the moment is unclear, I think, amidst the appalling material damage and human loss as well. But it's a very relevant question. I asked, one of the questions I asked to Amani Shaltut, who looks after the United Nations Visual Archive, was, she said, first of all, she said, the archive is safe. The archive that she controls is safe. They had a degree of funding some years ago which allowed them to digitize. So they were in cooperation with the UN headquarters, the UNRWA headquarters in Amman. Everything that was in Gaza was digitized and then uploaded, and it's safe, although the physical assets that were stored in Gaza City in the building are not safe. She said to me, one of the things she said was, and we can talk about this as well in other ways, about assumptions. I said, did you not have a plan for being able to move this archive in case of a crisis erupting? And she said, well, up till now, up till this war, the United Nations buildings have been off limits. And they've not been bombed, and they've not been targeted specifically. Now, Israel is specifically targeting UN facilities, including the UNRWA headquarters building with its archive in it. So she said no, there was some of the physical archive is lost, and it's been damaged. She's now displaced. She can't get back to be able to start documenting and recataloguing. But I think the control of archive, yes, it's a live question and it's extremely important. I don't know if you want to bring in.
Yeah, I'm not aware of the conversation have started already because we are not post-war still, unfortunately.
We're mid-war.
We're mid-war, and still, of course, the human loss is taking priority, and we're still speaking about the safety of the human beings regarding the safety of objects. There's 3-4 things. I mean, we should look at one. There's 180 historical sites in Gaza that was destroyed. So there's the building itself. I think 80 are UNESCO, if I'm not mistaken, 80 or 68. I think the exact figure is UNESCO registered sites that has been gone. There is the photos. We speak about 3 families, 3 the Armenian families. One is safe, one we don't know about it, one is lost. Complete negatives of one of the 3 families that Matthew spoke about, of the Armenian photographers. We speak about the Gaza municipality, which had a lot of it had a library and had a lot of rare books and rare manuscript, and the municipality is bombed. And what is under the rubbles, if we ever going to be rescued, I don't know. Rain is coming, of course, and water and so on. One of our contributors, which also Matthew mentioned, is Chris Abdul Karim. He wrote a beautiful essay, which is based on his personal experience with going to one of the, if you like, shops, on antique shops, but it was by an old Gazans who had all types of things, maps and
documents,
books and yes, and pictures and passports and IDs and all of these things. And that shop is being bombed, flattened. So that's another examples of actual loss of assets. There is, in literature, there is Mouin Pseso, a very famous Palestinian poet who is from Gaza, his story is also in the book. All his archives was in his house in a suitcase that his son has prepared, that if things goes wrong, he will just gonna take this suitcase and leave.
Right.
The situation was so bad that the house was bombed and he couldn't take the suitcase. So we don't exactly sure about this suitcase of Mouin Pseso, one of the top 5 poets of Palestine, if you like, with all his writings, probably unpublished word and so on. So it's a tricky, because we work in culture, in art, and that kind of world. You really get sad when a loss of a physical heritage element of it is lost. We essentially we programmed for the preservation of these, and I think the scale is yet to be seen on the destruction of those things after this war is finished. And it's going to be very, very, very painful story. Very painful story. But there is at least 40, 50, if not 100,000 people died.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's this duality is very inconvenient to, yeah.
It's very difficult to talk even about the books if we have to talk about the people. And I think what makes your book so not only important, but also so, you know, it will really reach a lot of people, because it has also the literary quality of the texts, because it's not just a news report like I would write it, but you have voices of poets, but also of people really writing out of their, you know, being on the run, which is just incredibly interesting to read some of them beyond the pure news aspects of it. And there was one, for example, by this journalist Asma Al-Ghul, that you also, we spoke about that before, where she writes, "My father's brother, Ismail Al-Ghul, 60, was not a member of Hamas. His wife, Khadra, 62, was not a militant of Hamas. Their sons, Wael, 35, and Mohammed, 32, were not combatants for Hamas. Their daughters, Hanadi, 28, and Asma, 22, were not operatives for Hamas. Nor were my cousin Wael's children, Ismail, 11, Malak, 5, and baby Mustafa, only 24 days old, members of Jihad, Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or Fatah. Yet they all died in the Israeli shelling that targeted their home at 6:20 a.m. And what she says then also is that they were all not Hamas. Obviously, the children were not Hamas. And the whole family was not Hamas. But then she goes on and says, Hamas to you is women, children, and innocent families. If Hamas in your eyes is ordinary civilians and families, then I am Hamas. And so you read this and you wonder if what we say sort of in a very easy way while we sit in the safety of Vienna, that of course this war will create many, many radicalized young people and also old people. But what does it actually mean for the population now and the relationship to Hamas that everyone is treated like terrorists by being bombarded?
Let me talk just a little. I'm going to hand over to you because I know you have plenty to say, or you will have plenty to say. I think it's much more important talking about radicalization to talk about trauma. I think the legacy that this will lead will leave in future generations is much less to do with radical politics. There may be radicalized people, there may not be. What everybody will experience and what everybody is experiencing now and will experience into the future is trauma, is the most horrific kind of mental and emotional damage from what has been inflicted over the last 12 months. To me, that's far more pressing and far more urgent a question to face than who is Hamas, will Hamas get better, will Hamas improve or not improve, or expand or not expand, will it recruit more, will it not recruit more. The people and their trauma and the compassion that we must show towards people who are suffering supersedes any questions to do with this particular political party, in my mind.
Mm-hmm. My first instinct is to also challenge this one lead into another, ultimately, unquestionably. I mean, it also takes away the humanity of people to say that they must be seeking revenge or they must become radical after that. I mean, I don't know, this is based, I mean, I understand that this is one line of thinking, but I don't want to put a must at the beginning of it, right? Because I always think that the Palestinians, as being the oppressed of this conflict, we will always have to take a higher ethical, moral grounds. It's very easy for me to say this sitting in seats in Vienna, but I'm under no delusion that it's we Palestinians, because of the being the oppressed nature of this conflict, we will have to break the circle of violence, and we will have to show a higher moral, ethical grounds. I'm not saying like this is ultimately what has to happen in Gaza, but this could happen, and I to some extent I hope it does happen. But I want to challenge this, is like it must be after this there will be thousands of people who just want to go and kill other people. I mean, you know, people are also humans, and they might not forget, but they might forgive. They might develop a feeling that could feed into. I'm just trying to continue with the premise of the book of being hopeful as well. But it's also, there's an element of dehumanization that I don't want to subscribe to, that people are almost animals and they will just, because they are persecuted, they're going to go and persecute again. And then there's something uncomfortable about that, right? And particularly I'm basing this on a long traditions of Palestinian culture and ethics and moralities as well. Not by being special, but because they are oppressed. And if we look at other examples of the word, the oppressed always also took a higher ethical and moral grounds. And that's by for sure is a necessity. Now, the simplicity, I understand, that's the media, unfortunately, particularly Western media, is everyone's Hamas, as I think need to be called out, because it's not just based on lack of knowledge or trying to simplify it to justify what the Israelis are doing in Gaza, but I think it's deep-rooted in a much more problematic concept of racism, perhaps Islamophobia, perhaps Orientalism, of how the image is seen coming from the East. Because this time it's all Hamas, but at some point before the 90s, they were all BLO, and before that they were all socialist, and before that they were all I don't know what. There's always an easy tag that you can put on people out there to justify essentially killing them. So I just want to call that out as well. It's not just for simplicity or for lack of understanding that the media and even the politicians, they throw in this, they all Hamas. It's not just justification, it's actually telling of a much more deeper prejudice against the Middle East. And there is unfortunately a history of this in the Western countries on how things are perceived in the Middle East. And the fact that Israel is seen as a Western ally, or looks like us, or part of us, and this shared values with Israel and so on, it's exactly feeding into this. Because when the West speak about, we can't really criticize Israel because we have shared values with Israel, I was like, what is exactly the shared values between the West and Israel when Israel is committing genocide? The only shared values I can think is actually committing genocide as well. And then there's a European history of genocide as well, whether in the First, Second World War, or even before that. So it's need a much more deeper response than just explaining that not all people are Hamas. It need a much more analysis and much more harsher response, to be honest, to the media and politics to address this historical prejudice against the East. Because if this time we let it be against Hamas, sometimes in the near future it will be against someone else.
No, absolutely. I mean, what you said now, how the struggle of the Palestinians was perceived over the decades. Of course, it was the PLO, then Yasser Arafat was sort of normalized as a partner, and then it moved on now to demonize the next generation in Hamas. The problem, of course, with Hamas, or also the other Islamist groups, they also suppress their people, they oppress women, and also in Gaza today. That's something which is, of course, now also not necessarily the main question in the middle of this war, which just kills everyone, doesn't matter who they suppress, everyone is getting killed, which is a catastrophe that we, as you say, will have to deal with for decades to come. And the consequences of it. But it's still also a valid question how people in Gaza relate now to Hamas and what Hamas means. We talked a little bit about this before, but again, in the Western perception, it's very difficult to understand what this relationship is. Because on the one hand, you had Hamas when they took over the Gaza Strip, the political leadership, threw out the Fatah officials out of the windows out of the offices physically, but also took over the whole thing. And for people to understand here how this will work eventually to establish there an administration that is also after 20 years, of course, deeply rooted in the society and took over from garbage collection to education to all the political decisions. How this will work will be an interesting question, and it is addressed a little bit in the book also. But is that something where you see it's difficult to talk to people now in Gaza because they also cannot talk freely?
For the book, we like to think that they were talking freely, and there's all types of voices. That wasn't a criteria or wasn't the main question, because we were telling people, tell us your stories, not what is your political affiliation or your political dimension. So I would like to think that we get a diverse views on this question in the book. But ultimately, of course, this is a good question to have once the war ends and once we actually know how many people died and once we get to bury the dead in dignity and start to speak about re-establishing life in the Gaza Strip. Of course, that will be a question. And this is not a question that's going to be decided in Vienna. This is going to be a question that's going to be decided by the Palestinians having a working political institution without the interference of the Israelis or without the interference of the West. And then they go to elections and they produce their leaders. I mean, we are a few weeks away from the American elections, and Trump also oppressed women, and also against black people, and also against LGBT people, and so on. But we'll see what the elections. Why this privilege, right, of people having a very strong political confrontations and go and settle it in elections is only given to the West, but it's never given to the people in the East. In the East, is always someone has to come and decide which political party is, so to speak, is kosher to be in the elections, and which are not. And we almost wanted to put the horse before the cart. So let the Palestinians, let the Lebanese, let the Jordanians, let the Syrians, let whoever is create. If Europe is a force for liberal democracy, and that's the ultimate goal, let's create an atmosphere. Let's support institutions that enable free discussions before elections that will lead into a political discourse and elections, and then hopefully, if the liberal progressive ideas is the one that we think is the good ones, they will prevail also in the East, because the people in the East are just like us. They also wanted prosperity and security and freedoms as well. But to dictate beforehand, I think is a problematic concept that's have been tried and failed for a long time on the relationship on how we deal with the Middle East. I know who I will be voting in the next elections if there is elections, but the fact that there was never election in Palestine in the last 16, 17 years, and now we need to start to assess who support Hamas and who doesn't in Gaza, when actually the last political election happened in Gaza was 17 years ago, so you probably have 50% of the people have even never been participating in any elections. It's quite an unjust treatment, I think, and it's a bit problematic for me to start to measure where the support is if we don't have the actual process.
But do people tell you criticism of the Hamas also in the conversations?
We have criticism in the book of Hamas as well.
I know, I looked for it. And as I say, it's maybe not the most important question, I think, for a Western audience. It's an important question to also see who the partners are in Gaza, if the sort of European governments, for example, have Hamas just simply on the list of terrorist organizations. So it's a very difficult relationship to establish who to talk to. And so I wonder how strong this is in conversations you have with people, or if that's not playing the real role.
It wasn't, in our particular conversations, the conversations, as Mahmoud said, that we had for this book, it wasn't an issue at all. We weren't asking people whether they like this or don't like this, whether this is a political party they subscribe to or don't subscribe to. This is not a book about Hamas. We're not writing about Hamas. I'm sorry to say it so boldly, Hamas is the least interesting thing in Gaza. The policies of Hamas, yes, it's an extremely socially conservative and religiously conservative, authoritarian political system that uses violence to stay in power. There's much more to Gaza than its politics. There's much more to Gaza than what this particular clique of people have done to Gaza. That's what this book is trying to draw out, to expand the question of how to deal with Gaza post-war, once we come into a state of post-war, and to refocus the discussion on the people. The least interesting thing about Britain for me is the Labour Party at the moment. It's like they don't say anything about the country, where the country is, what the country's mindset is, where people want to go, what there's a mood about is not necessarily, and most of the time not absolutely, reflected in the political structures and the political levers of power. If you want to have a discussion about Britain and British society and British culture and what is important to British people, I would advise you stay well away from Westminster altogether, because that's not where the answer is. And in a similar way, if we want to focus on the Gazans, if we want to focus on Palestinian culture, Palestinian history, what there is to offer, what is not known about, what should be better known about, and where we should be taking the discussion, then Hamas is not going to give you any answers.
Well, I mean, the book certainly gives you a lot of what you just said, and I think it's really important for many people to read it because so little is known. And you said this in your presentation already, also the 5,000 years of having cities in that place and sort of going through all the history of it. But one of the things that that lingers a little bit over the book for me is when you read the news now and you have the feeling there are plans by some of the ministers in the Israeli government to not have a population in Gaza anymore after this war. So there's a big question where you think, okay, is this the first part of the story only describing the history and the present life in Gaza and what is being destroyed? And will we then have a situation where maybe, there will not be the population, or at least not in the north of it? I mean, there's already relatively clear plans that are being published and being discussed relatively openly by parts of the Israeli government to empty the north of Gaza and squeeze the population into the south, which eventually maybe they might hope that the whole Palestinian population leaves to Egypt. And so I wonder if this was a subject also in the conversations with the authors, with the contributors of the book, that people are actually fearing, not only as they describe in the book now, how they were asked to leave the north of Gaza and they went to the south, and then they were asked to leave from Khan Yunis and go to the other places, the protected areas, so-called protected areas that were not protecting them. So I wonder if this is a subject that is hanging over the book in a sense too?
Yeah, I mean, it's Israel have all types of plans all the time for all types of things. There's a question of responsibility here. Israel had a plan from day one to actually push people out of Gaza, and people did not push. They had plans to empty the north from the first few months. Now we know that there is still hundreds of thousands of people are in the north. They are now being thrown with famine and no access to clean water or food, so they can go to the south, but they are not as well. So the Palestinians' population resistance to the Israeli plan is there because they know what is the Israeli, shall I say, romanticized image about that strip is. So the people are, I think, and it was very obvious throughout the book, that people are aware of the size of responsibility that they have as individuals, and they are trying with measured decisions on their own safety is to also challenge the political plans. I would like also to say that we have also responsibility here as people as well. I mean, Israel doesn't do this just by itself. It does that with American support and European support. So the displacement of people from the south to the north is not an Israeli plan. It will be a crime against humanity, displacement of people. That we know this by the international laws that we study and we speak about. So the fact that this is distance, Israel has plans, and whether they're going to do it or not, and we kind of ask the question is one thing. But the other is what we are doing as international community, as solidarity groups, as people who care about international law, what we are doing to stop this. I have 3 daughters. The oldest one is 12. Throughout the last year, I always thought there's gonna come a day when my daughter gonna ask me, when there was a genocide in 2023 and you were watching it in your iPhone, what did you do about it? And my selfish reason for working on the book is one of those answers. But we should all be asking ourselves, what is the answer that we're going to give to our loved ones or to ourselves in 10, 15, 5 years when we're going to get asked, what have you done back then? And the question is not just an individual one, it's a collective one. What is Europe is doing to stop the continuation of the displacement? What is Austria is doing to stop the displacement of the people of Gaza? Is a question that will reflect collectively in where is Austria is vis-a-vis human rights and international law in 15 or 20 years. Just to throw everything is what Israel is want and what is Biden is trying to do, and to distance ourselves from this, I think it's uncomfortable for me as well. We all, we celebrate the fact that the world is a small village and we all affecting each other, and we all, but that has a tax to it, that has a responsibility to it, and the question of responsibility is also on us.
Let me add in a little bit as well. What Israel did, or what Israel may or may not do to Gaza, could be related to what Israel has already done in other places. So as you were asking the question, I was thinking of Jaffa. Jaffa was attacked by Israel, was depopulated. The population was largely removed from the old town of Jaffa on the port on the sea and was moved elsewhere. And there was massive cultural eradication over a number of years and a number of decades. Jaffa remains a Palestinian city. What Israel did does not affect as I talked about here, the psychogeography of what Jaffa is and what Jaffa means. Israel has absorbed Jaffa into being a suburb of Tel Aviv.
Flea market.
Well, yeah, it has all sorts of romanticizations as well, but anyway. And it's tried to co-opt Jaffa. The municipality now has Jaffa as a part of the title of the city to make it appear to be some unified entity that is all Israeli. It's not. The people of Jaffa know it's not. And people outside Jaffa know it's not. And certainly the Palestinians of the world know that it's not. So whatever whatever Israel did to Jaffa, physically on the ground, it changed the city. In every other way, it did not. And so whatever Israel does to Gaza, Gaza will remain Palestinian, and Gaza will still be a Palestinian place and a Palestinian city with Palestinian culture that has been documented at least to some degree in this book and others as well, and in the voices of the people who live there and have lived there.
Well, the question is if Jaffa can be, since it's a sort of in Israel since 1948, be part of the Israel that will stay Israel, while maybe other parts like Gaza could be the place for a Palestinian state. Which doesn't mean that Palestinians will not live in Jaffa, or it will not be in the mind, as you say, the geography, an Arab town, which it of course is. I mean, historically is, yeah. But that's sort of one of the tricky and very interesting questions that hopefully can be addressed when the war stops, if it ever stops. Let us see if there are questions from the audience. We are basically out of time.